this notion that there's considerable economic value, that there's a considerable economic premium on a college education is based on what universities used to do, which is this more of, like you were saying, this truth seeking, open inquiry, high standard, high rigor kind of approach. Whereas the modern university has repudiated that. And so what you're finding is that students are leaving university to these higher paying jobs, but they're unprepared for the work that they actually have to do in corporate America in various positions. So there's this premium on university education that doesn't seem to be at all connected with what universities are now doing. It's dubious for the university to be promoting the economic value that they provide because that economic value is all based on a system that they've repudiated. The way forward is what we were doing 50 years ago.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Scott Scheall. Scott spent the majority of his academic career at Arizona State University, the largest university in the world. And he's now a professor at the University of Austin, arguably the smallest university in the world, and also America's newest higher education institution. In today's episode, Scott and I talk about the bureaucracy that exists inside of ASU and other large academic institutions. And we talk about the perverse incentives that exist inside of that bureaucracy that make it so incredibly difficult for faculty to deliver a quality education. We talk about the war on free speech inside of college campuses and what University of Austin is doing to protect free speech as a core pillar of the academic education it is delivering. And we talk about how Scott was a direct casualty in an academic sense of the war against free speech and the free exploration of ideas, and how he was denied tenure at ASU for studying ideas that were politically incorrect. This was a fascinating episode. Scott is a delight to talk to, and I hope you enjoy listening. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Hannah. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to be here too. I'm so excited to get to ask you a whole bunch of questions. You have an interesting story. You recently moved from perhaps the largest university in the world to what is perhaps the smallest university in the world, and also the newest, the University of Austin. That's a big jump. That's a big change. Why?
Wow. Well, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to answer the why with a short response. But so I'll tell you that. So I was at Arizona State University, which I haven't looked at the latest student population statistics, but has been at different times in the last couple of years the largest university in the world. And I left Arizona State to come to the University of Austin, which, with our currently 92 students, I think may very well be the smallest. So that's been a very interesting experience moving from I used to compare Arizona State ASU to a 1 square mile wide DMV office. It was just all bureaucracy all the way down. It was just the most heavily bureaucratic environment you could possibly imagine. So to move from that environment to this kind of startup environment has been really a great change. One of the things that that we're doing as we develop the University of Austin is really kind of building many of the structures of the university sort of on the fly. Some of the, like, for example, I'm on a committee right now at the University of Austin to construct our faculty governance procedures and our faculty governance committee and things like that. So, that's something where at Arizona State, they've had a faculty senate for as long as the university has been there. So we're building all of these structures that exist at other universities, sort of from the ground up and really on the fly. So That's been interesting. But to get to your question about why, I guess maybe I'll break it down into positive reasons and negative reasons. The positive reasons are that I saw the University of Austin being developed when it was first announced. I forget exactly when it was announced. Was it 2020 or 2021?
It was November of 21.
Okay. Yeah, I was one of those 3,000 or so professors who submitted their CVs on day one. So I saw it. I saw the
Whoa.
announcement. No, I literally saw the announcement and saw the email at the bottom of the announcement of like, oh, here's my CV. And I think I wrote a message, something along the lines of, what parts of my body, what limbs do I have to cut off to be hired at the University of Austin? Because I'm willing to cut off whatever you want me to cut off. I'll do anything. I'll
What did it end up being? Did you lose one?
no, I'm still fully limbed. I did not have to give up any of my body parts, but I was very eager to make the move, and the reason was just that I saw what University of Austin wanted to do philosophically and pedagogically was exactly where I wanted to be, and actually what I had been saying for about a decade leading up to 2021 needed to happen in American academia if there was going to be anything like a return to sanity. So I was at Arizona State well, as a faculty member, I was at Arizona State for 14 years, but I also did my graduate work there. So I saw the student side and I saw the faculty side as well. And I was there while you could see the rules and the standards and the rigor all being broken down, and you could see the modern system of, the patient-led insane asylum that modern universities have become. You could see that growing. The sort of the first thing that happened at ASU, and this happened at many places around the country around the same time, was that a greater emphasis came to be put on student evaluations, on students' evaluations of your teaching, and they've always had that system, but it never was an important element in considerations like tenure and promotion. Well, eventually it became a really key consideration in your sort of employment. So getting good student evaluations was a way to secure your employment, or I should say, actually, getting bad student evaluations was a way to put your employment at risk. So, once you have that kind of system in place where the students are evaluating your teaching, and those student evaluations are a criteria that are used to determine, or criterion that are used to determine whether you're going to be employed or not, you get to automatically get grade inflation, right? Because all the professors are like, well, I want to keep my job. So how do I keep my job? Well, I keep the students happy. And how do I keep the students happy? I give them good grades. At the same time, though, it's not just the grade inflation. You see a complete, annihilation of all standards, right? So when I first started teaching in 2000, 2008, 2009, I was a hard teacher. Like I had really high standards and I kept my students to them. But as I came to realize that that was only a way of ensuring that I got negative student evaluations and thereby was putting my employment at risk, you know, I lowered my standards. I started teaching much easier classes, much lower standards, and much less rigor. And by the time I left ASU, all of my teaching evaluations were within the margin of error of a perfect score. So how do you do that? You do that by keeping your students happy. And how do you keep your students happy? You make it easy and you give them good grades. And that's how the system currently exists at large universities like ASU. I know ASU best, but I also know how the system works elsewhere, and that's basically the system everywhere in large public and some private universities. Like I said, the patients are running the insane asylum, and so I saw that happening over the course of my tenure at ASU, and I had been saying since early in the 2010s that if American university education was going to return to its sort of position of excellence, what we needed really was competition among universities. We needed, if ASU and other schools wanted to do their system, fine, let them do it. But what we needed were competing institutions that were going to maintain those very high standards, that were going to put an emphasis on excellence and rigor and merit. And then, sort of let the chips fall where they may. Let those systems compete with each other to see which system produced the best students, which system produced the most attractive students for corporate America and for leadership roles in America. And my assumption has always been that that system would be the one that would win out. And so when I saw that that was basically what University of Austin wanted to do, that they wanted to create this very rigorous, very meritocratic, high standards sort of system that really emphasized the traditional criteria that made American universities really the envy of the world, I was like, well, that's where I want to be. So I immediately made I started applying every time there was an opportunity to apply at the University of Austin. I submitted my CV, and I luckily, as it turned out, ended up getting what is in effect my dream job. I mean, this really is my dream position in academia. It had gotten so bad for me at ASU that I was really considering leaving academia. There was a period of time where I was actually thinking about going back and waiting tables or tending bar or something like that, just simply because, if I could maintain my research profile, if I could continue to do my research and then work at night, work in a restaurant or something, and make roughly, I mean, not quite as much money as a professor makes, but roughly what a professor makes, I would do. I would have done that in a second. So that's one of the major reasons. Now, as it turns out, but those are both a combination of negative reasons and positive reasons. I was positively attracted to the University of Austin, and I was negatively turned off by what was going on at ASU. As it turns out, I I was denied tenure at ASU. That was the parting shot of my experience at the university. I had already accepted the position at Austin, so I was going to move no matter what. But I waited to turn in my resignation at ASU until I got my tenure decision. And as it turned out, they denied me tenure. And not only did they deny me tenure, they were not going to give me. I went up for tenure after 5 years on the tenure track, and I had 7 years to get tenure. So I had 2 more years that I could have gone up for tenure at ASU. And not only did they deny me tenure, they said they weren't going to give me those 2 extra years. So I was going to be fired at ASU at the end of this year. They were going to give me a 1 year contract and then let me go. So so in effect I had no choice. Now, like I said, I was already planning to move to Austin, but if I had not gotten the job at Austin, I would be in my last year at ASU, and I scrambling to get a job either elsewhere in academia or, like I said, just waiting to return to the restaurant industry where I worked for years when I was in college. So I was in a sense kind of pushed out from ASU, even though I had already accepted the position at Austin. But I will say, and this is also relevant to our topic, is there was no I was denied tenure at ASU for what can only be described as bad, subjective political reasons. There were no good objective reasons why I should have been denied tenure at ASU. My publication record, my contribution to my intellectual community, I think, is by any objective measure qualifies for tenure. Everybody that I have spoken to, both at ASU and at other institutions, is utterly appalled that I was denied tenure at ASU. No one can give me any good objective reason why that should have happened. But I happen to study people. I'm a historian. A philosopher of economics is really my background, and I happen to study people in the history of economics who are politically disfavored. So I'm a scholar of the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, who is often criticized as being rabid, crazy, conservative, libertarian. He really wasn't, but that's how he's viewed by people on the other side. And so, between the fact that I was, I think, branded a conservative at a major university, whether I am or not is beside the point. But I was branded a conservative. That was one reason why I was denied tenure. I also, of course, uh, made ha, have made no effort to endear myself to the administration at ASU. I wrote a book a couple of years ago that is available for free on the internet. Actually, I ended up publishing it for free, in which I use the administration of Arizona State University as a paradigm of incompetence. So my hope when I went up for tenure was that they wouldn't read that book, but maybe they did. Maybe they read the book, and so that may have surely that was an unwise decision on my part. But I tend to this is also why I'm at the University of Austin. I tend to be more concerned with the truth than with what is gonna keep me in good stead with the administration, right? So I had burnt some bridges there while I was still trying to cross them at ASU, which was not the wisest thing. But so yeah, I think that's a very long-winded answer to your question of why I left ASU and why I came to the University of Austin.
We have to talk about this book.
Yeah.
And there's a couple threads here that are really interesting in terms of the incompetence that you were in the bureaucracy that you were feeling inside of ASU. So one, it is wild to think that ASU is structured in such a way where students are, in theory, paying for a good education. They're paying, in theory, to receive a college level learning, to be challenged, to push themselves, to come out stronger than they came in. And yet the system is set up in such a way where the incentives are causing the opposite effect.
Yeah.
That's wild.
The incentive structure at an institution like ASU, and I don't want to be too harsh on ASU because I think this is a common problem at all large universities like that around the country. Um, the incentives that the students face and that the instructors face and even that the administrators face are completely out of whack. So one of the things that I've been really interested in, I've been wanting to write an editorial about this. Actually, and going back to the Claudine Gay fiasco last year or earlier in 2024 with the presidents giving their horrible testimony in front of the Congress and Elise Stefanik, raking them over the coals, and then them a couple of them leaving or getting fired. Ever since then, I've been wanting to write this editorial, and the topic of the editorial would be why do the worst people get on top at large universities like that? So if you look at the administrative structure of a giant university like ASU, you will often find that the people in the highest positions are the least successful academics. They're the people with the fewest citations. They're the people with the least sort of defensible research programs. And that's an interesting question. Why would you encourage? Why would you reward, in effect, what is failure at the professorial mission, right? Why would you reward the people who aren't good professors, who can't do the research, who can't get published? Well, it's precisely because the incentives are such that, I mean, you can basically succeed at a large university like that in many different ways. One way to succeed is by being a top of your field researcher who publishes in the best journals, whose work gets cited, who is writing the most prestigious books, who is really a top of the line scholar. Or you can succeed by engaging in a whole bunch of service activities, right? So you can succeed by serving on committees and serving on, volunteering for this role or volunteering for that role. And it's often from that stream that the administrators get hired. right? So the incentives are basically, if you can't do, the line is, um, those who can those who can at large universities do, those who can't become administrators. So if you can succeed as a professor at a large university, you do, because the life of a professor is awesome. It is the greatest life. What do? You write papers, you teach classes. It's such a great life. I mean, you're not even expected to really like be in the office all that often, right? You do your work, you choose your own research topics. It's an amazing life. If you can succeed in that life, you're naturally going to choose that life. But if you can't, and if you don't want to go back to being a bartender, like I was considering, you're going to take the administrative option, right? You're going to take I'll serve on all these service committees. I'll do this role. I'll volunteer to be the director of this or the director of that. And that's another way, another route to advancement at a major university. So I looked at the Claudine Gay situation. Here you have this person who is the president of the most prestigious university in the world, who is obviously an inferior researcher, right? I mean, obviously an inferior researcher. She was never top of her field in anything. I mean, as it turned out, we found out that she was also a plagiarizer, but that was beside the point, right? She was just never top of her field. Well, how did she get to that position at Harvard? It wasn't because she was a top of her field researcher. It was because she took on all of the administrative roles. She was willing to do all of this service. And that was her path to eventually becoming the president of Harvard. Now, of course, in her situation, there are also these DEI considerations that played a role as well, and that's another aspect to this story as well. But basically, like I said, if you can be a good professor, if you can be a top of your field researcher, that's the life that you're going to choose, because it's an awesome life. But if you can't do that, you're going to do something else to maintain your territory at the university, and that might mean taking on all of these administrative roles. So you end up with a situation where you have deans and directors and vice presidents and presidents of universities who are just garbage scholars. They're garbage scholars because they took the service route to get to their lofty positions, rather than taking the scholarly excellence route. And I forgot what your question was. That's right, on this diatribe. Um,
Well, part of it wasn't a question, it was just an expression of just sort of the insanity of the incentive structure, but
right.
there is a
Yeah.
question in here too, which is, I've spent most of my career in the startup world. I can't stand bureaucracy. If an organization gets bigger than about 20 people, it starts to be too bureaucratic for me. Like once you have HR, I'm kind of done.
Yeah.
Personal preference, but working inside of a place with as much bureaucracy as ASU is hard to even imagine, because the layers of administration at every level, it must be wild to be inside of it. And I'm curious what that's like, and also maybe where some of the unexpected places were that you would run into bureaucracy if you were trying to do something. Obviously, there's these weird bureaucratic structures where nobody's actually looking at the quality of your teaching. They're looking at the student ratings, which is bureaucratic and backwards, and not how the incentive structures should be arranged if the goal is actually delivering a good product to the students as opposed to just making them happy. But I would imagine there are many other similar things that are bureaucratic and convoluted that you would run into in both, the design of your classes and what was happening in your classrooms, but also the research work that you were trying to do.
Yeah. The bureaucracy at ASU was really overwhelming, both for the faculty and for the students, and for everybody. One of the most frustrating things about being there was that you could never get a straight answer about a simple question. Um, you know, uh, Whatever it might be, you would be bounced around from this department to this department to that department to this department, and you could never really get a straight answer. Like whatever your simple question might be, it would have just taken far too long to find a response, and that was true. I remember being a student at ASU and just being enormously frustrated by that kind of thing. Like, where do I go to get my ID card? That should be a simple question, but the answer was never straightforward, and it was never easy to find. So the bureaucracy was really, really very overwhelming. And you would encounter it at every level. I'll give you an example. So I've left ASU. I'm no longer an employee at ASU. Yet last week I got a letter in the mail out of the blue from Arizona State University telling me that I owe them 500 some odd dollars. And this is quintessential ASU. This is quintessential big university system. Um, the letter indicates that I owe them this amount, but there's no itemization. There's no indication of what it is. It doesn't even say what I owe them $500 for. So it's like, what do you mean I owe you $500? And then, of course, my mind boggles at the fact that when I left ASU, they had my last paycheck for 2 weeks after I left. So if I owed them any money, take it out of my last paycheck. What is the big deal? Then this is hilarious. The letter says that they have been trying to reach me via my ASU email address. Now, the university, not me, the university shut down my ASU email address 2 days after I resigned from the university. It hasn't been in operation since May of this year. But yet the university is trying to contact me at this email address that they shut down. I didn't shut it down. So I actually plan later this afternoon to go over to the main campus in Tempe and go to the this is the other thing that's strange. The letter is signed Student Business Services. I haven't been a student at ASU since 2012. I was a faculty member up until May of this year. So what do I owe the Student Business Services? Anyways, I'm going to go over there this afternoon and I'm going to have this. It's going to be a very frustrating conversation with people in Student Business Services trying to get an explanation for what it is that I owe them this money, why I owe them this money, why they didn't just take it out of my last paycheck, why they've been trying to contact me at an email address that they shut down. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you encounter at a ginormous institution like ASU. It really is, just a giant DMV office. That's the kind of, customer experience you have at a giant university like that. It's like going in and trying to renew your driver's license. The people are just as friendly. They're just as, I mean that jokingly, they're just as rude, they're just as unmotivated to help you. They're just as, they don't know and they don't care. They don't, so that's what it's like, the bureaucratic structure at a giant university like that. So I would warn students, high school students that are thinking about going to college. It's not just about the quality of the education. I mean, obviously that's an important consideration, but you should really do a little bit of investigation into the other aspects of the student experience at different universities. Does this university treat you as a human being, or does it treat you as just another number in line at a DMV office, basically?
Oh,
I mean, the other thing that would sort of relates to your question is that it was never clear to me exactly why, or it's become less clear to me why students would want to attend an institution where they weren't really getting an education. I mean, like I used to say, and I think this is true, I used to say that at ASU, we didn't provide students with an education. We provided them with a piece of paper that said we had provided them with an education, right? Two very different things, right? One is an education. The other is just a certification process. And the certification can be, what you're being certified for can be more or less robust. So, students, they weren't getting a quality education. They were getting a diploma at the end of 4 years that they could hold up to employers to say, like, look, I got an education. But no, there was nothing, there's no there.
How inevitable do you think it is that if a university grows to the size of ASU or, a different state university that's not as large as ASU, but still, very sizable student body, very sizable amount of people working inside the organization, Do you think it's inevitable that it will end up with this level of bureaucracy? Do you think that it is, if you want to escape that, you have to attend or work at or build a smaller institution? Or do you think this isn't inevitable and there are just bad paradigms that have led to this being the norm?
I think that it's in part a function of size, but it's also a function of the structure of the university. So uh, ASU is actually an interesting example of this because when I was an undergraduate student there, it's funny. I served every possible function you could serve at ASU. I was an undergraduate student. I was a graduate student there. In between my undergraduate and my graduate education, I worked at the university in the foundation in the 501c3 nonprofit area of the university, and then somehow miraculously I became a faculty there, and eventually a tenure track faculty there. So I was, I think, for a time the only member of the ASU faculty, other than Kirsten Sinema, Senator Sinema, who is also a faculty member at ASU, who had all of my degrees from ASU. So I know where all the skeletons are buried, and I know the entire history of the last 25 years of the university. And it used to be when I was a student there, an undergraduate student there in the late 90s, it was not this bureaucratic. It was, I mean, don't get me wrong, it was never, there was always a certain level of bureaucracy, but it was never as bad as it became. And so I think it's in part a function of the size, but more than anything, it's a function of the way the university is structured. So one of the things that makes ASU particularly difficult to survive is the way there's just different levels of things, right? So it used to be when I was there as an undergraduate, there was there was the president, there was the provost, and there were like four vice presidents. It was very lean structure. Um, in the early 2000s, when the current president came on, he's still president now, he started to expand that administrative bureaucratic structure so that now you have presidents, vice presidents upon vice presidents, directors of this, directors of that, deans and sub deans and associate deans and department chairs and sub department chairs. So that's part of the reason why you just can't get an answer for anything, right? Because there's so many levels that you have to go through to get to your answer, that it just becomes very frustrating. So I think that a large university could survive, or it could be less bureaucratic if it simply had a leaner, administrative structure. If it were more obvious to the students and employees, which department did which thing. I mean, that's another thing is like all of these different layers, right? They all have very similar sounding things. There's there's the Center for the Study of this and that and this, and then there's the student services, this student service, that student service. So it's like if you just want a straightforward question, you really don't know where you should go. And so yeah, I think it's possible for a large university to survive less bureaucratically, but it requires kind of a will from the top to not allow those administrative positions to just become too bloated.
Well, it seems like the incentive structure across the board is just completely broken too. Like the university is not incentivized at its core to deliver the best possible education. It's incentivized to have as many students as
Yes.
possible coming through its doors. And the students are not incentivized to get the best education possible because it doesn't actually matter in the hiring market. What people are looking for is the degree status. So they just want the piece of paper. And so in some ways, everyone's incentivized to make it as easy as possible, as opposed to make it be as efficient and as rigorous as possible.
Yes.
And so no one is there is no incentive for anyone inside of the system to fix this besides
No.
people who are, intrinsically motivated to build something for the sake of building it. But there's another piece to this, which is the university is supposed to be a place for pursuing ideas and exploring the frontiers of thought and debating ideas in a rational and civil way and finding the truth, or an approximation of it.
Mhm.
And that is still the ideal that people feel like they're being sold when they're pursuing a college education. You're
Yes.
supposed to go to university and learn true things and be exposed to a range of ideas. And yet, to your point about your experience going up for tenure, you got effectively like defunded because to use like a, marketplace metaphor for this, because you're the people who are supporting your work and giving you a place of employment to do it. By all intents and purposes, if you were doing all of the right things, you were publishing the papers, you were getting the citations, they just didn't like the work you were doing.
Yeah.
This is unfortunately not uncommon. So there's a
No,
whole
it's
other
not.
side to this, which is the lack of substance in what is actually being offered, and the sort of duplicity of
Yeah.
pretending like there is something of substance happening here when really it's all very flat and one-sided and lip service.
Yeah, no, the lip service is exactly right. So one of the things that's really frustrating about being in the world of academia is, this notion that there is a major premium on university education. That, the difference between what you get paid as a high school graduate and what you get paid, what opportunities you have as a college graduate is considerable. And that is how it should be, I think. I mean, I think it should be that if you go to college, you do earn more and have more opportunities than someone that just goes to high school. But so much of what's going on today, I'm not talking about 10 or 20 years ago, but so much of what's going on today in that regard is based on an older system that the universities have effectively repudiated, right? So this notion that there's considerable economic value, that there's a considerable economic premium on a college education, is based on what universities used to do, which is this more of, like you were saying, this truth-seeking, open inquiry, high standard, uh, high rigor kind of approach. Um, Whereas the modern university has repudiated that. And so what you're finding is that students are leaving university to these higher paying jobs, but they're unprepared for the work that they actually have to do in corporate America in various positions. So there's this premium on university education that doesn't seem to be at all connected with what universities are now doing. It's connected with what universities used to be doing. So it's a very dubious kind of notion that, or at least it's dubious for the university to be promoting the economic value that they provide, because that economic value is all based on a system that they've repudiated. Does that make sense? So I mean, I'm doubtful about the notion that students that are coming out of universities today, as they are currently structured, as given their current priorities, things like you were saying, like the emphasis is on, let's get as many students into the university as we possibly can. Let's get as many students into the university as we possibly can. Let's lower the standards so that it's easy for them to get through. Let's also lower the standards so that there's no reason for them to switch universities, right? So that we can retain them, because that's how these university administrators sort of compare each other, right? It's retention. Like, we retain a much higher percentage of our students than you do. Well, how do you ensure that retention? Well, one way you do it is just to make life easy to be at a particular university. So these students are being incentivized and retained on the basis of lower standards, non-existent standards, and then they're leaving the university ill prepared for success in the marketplace. And the corporate types are like, why can't these students read? Why can't they write? Why don't they understand the proper role of a comma? I mean, things like that, right? So, and they're having to be retrained at the corporate level for their actual jobs. So I don't think what universities are doing today is ultimately going to be sustainable. And that's why I think a system like University of Austin, what we're trying to do is the way forward, right? Because our students, they are going to leave prepared. They're going to leave able to read and to write and to solve complex problems. They're going to leave ready to be the next generation of American leaders, the next generation of corporate leaders. Whereas students that are coming out of the giant state universities are going to flounder in the corporate world and have to be retrained, re-prepared in their jobs in order to do those jobs. And I think eventually, I just think this is, I mean, this is all part of the education bubble that people talk about, right? I don't think it's sustainable. I think we're seeing as we speak this bubble being popped. And I think eventually what's going to happen is that the large universities are going to have to basically return to form, return to the old system if they're going to be able to compete with the University of Austin's and the Hillsdales and the you know some of these universities that are offering these like civic education, classical education sort of approaches. I think that's the way forward is what we were doing 50 years ago.
A lot of people look at the college bubble and the steep decline in value from a substantive stance, not necessarily practical sense, because the degree is still worth something in the job market, unfortunately. But that's changing too. But in like a substantive sense, the steep decline in the value of a college degree, obviously the news is full of anecdotes about the free speech and lack thereof on college campuses, the ability and lack thereof to pursue and explore controversial ideas. I think a lot of people look at that and think that the conclusion that they draw is that the college model is dead altogether, that it's just a relic of the past. The job market is changing. Access to information is changing. You can go and listen to lecture series on the internet without having to spend tens of thousands of dollars to do a year of university to attend the same levels of lectures.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people look at that and see the landscape as changing altogether, but it sounds like you're very bullish on the university as a model. It's more like you see the problem as being more the execution of said model as opposed to the model itself. Is that an accurate representation?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, it depends on what you consider to be a model. I mean, I think one way to think about what's going on is that the old model has been replaced with a newer and inferior model, right? Um, so, but then there's also just the concept of a university as itself as a model. So I think that I don't think universities are going away. I would love for there to be the kind of world where, and I think it's definitely true. I mean, what I hear you saying is that if you just want to be a good citizen, if you want to be a good citizen of a liberal democracy like the United States, you can do a lot of that just by sort of in an autodidactic kind of way, teaching yourself, doing your own reading, taking online classes, studying these YouTube possibilities and things like that. Um, the problem is that I don't. How do you get the certification out of that, right? How do you get the certification that leads you to success in the job market? Um, if there were a way to combine that kind of autodidactic approach with some sort of certification to sort of show, oh yes, this person did all of this work and they are really a quality human being and a good citizen and a future leader, that would be wonderful. But I think you're still going to need the university to serve that certification process. The problem is that the certification is no longer tied to any kind of substance, right? So you can get the certification by going to an ASU or going to a large university, but you're not getting the substance, right? You're actually not being prepared to be a good American citizen. You're not being prepared to be a corporate or government leader or a free thinker, or just someone who, a successful entrepreneur, someone who develops new ideas and turns them into successful businesses. You're not getting that at the certification mills. So I still think the problem is how do you combine those two things? How do you create the good citizen and also provide evidence that the good citizen has been created. We need to reconnect those two things that I think have been broken asunder at mainstream universities by, well, some of the things that we've talked about, this move toward emphasizing student evaluations, the kind of undermining of faculty governance that has happened at a lot of universities around the country, where I mean, one of the ways that ASU was able to do this, shifting towards a pure certification kind of system, is by totally undermining all faculty governance. So it used to be that the faculty would step in and say, no, the mission of the university is to provide, it's open inquiry, it's freedom of speech, it's this preparation for successful citizenship. Well, the faculty governance role was undermined when the new president came in back in 2000, and so that's what allowed him to get away with a lot of stuff that he's gotten away with. There's no longer a faculty presence that sort of stands their ground and says, no, we are not going to go for this. And actually, if anything, because of, again, to go back to the bad incentives, because so many professors are now incentivized to just go along with wherever the political winds are blowing, right? Whether that's in a DEI direction, whether that's in a critical theory kind of direction that tried to undermine these notions of freedom of speech and high standards, things like that. They go along with that. So it's not just that you don't have a faculty that is standing their ground and saying, no, we're not going to go along with this. They actually end up promoting these bad ideas, so that it really does become sort of a vicious circle where the administration is incentivizing bad ideas, and the faculty members are researching bad ideas and publishing about bad ideas and then teaching bad ideas, and you end up with students who don't know how to read, don't know how to write, don't know how to solve problems, and who are utterly ill prepared for success in the real world. Yeah.
So before I got into some of the more public facing education commentary work that I do now, I got my start in education working for a startup apprenticeship program that was helping kids land jobs in startups instead of going to college. And this sort of idea of the credentialing problem is one of the things that we spent a lot of time thinking about and working on, because, to your point, somehow you need to be able to signal to people that you are worth hiring, that you're worth working with, that you're worth taking a chance on. And that's what the college degree does. It's a filtration mechanism, and it's not actually worth anything in and of itself. It's a proxy measure for your competence, your ability to do a good job, your potential to rise inside of the workforce. And so people use it as a blanket filtration because we just can't sift the amount of information necessary to individually assess all of the details of every single person. So we just use this as a blanket. You either have it or you don't. You qualify this for this or you don't. But it's not actually, when you get down into the unit of the individual, it's not actually a super effective way of measuring someone, because there can be people of great merit who didn't attend a university but have studied and learned and sharpened themselves and are on a high growth trajectory. And there can be people who went to a university and, rated all their professors who gave them hard classes very poorly and did everything they needed to do to just get by. But one on paper has the degree and looks more like they have more merit than the other. So it's, when you get down to the level of an individual, it gets really messy and it gets really unclear. But I would argue that there are other ways of signaling that competence beyond just the degree. The degree is useful in a social setting, but it's not necessarily, on a societal level. It serves a function, but on an individual level, I don't think it's actually necessary. Like, there are other ways of attaining the same result beyond going to university. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that, because if a young person came to me who was high potential and was saying, I want to go out in the world, and if there were specific things that they wanted to do that required having a degree, like be a lawyer, go into politics, for which a law degree is very helpful, or, become a doctor or something like that, or, a researcher at a university, obviously the university track is where I would send them. But if they were interested in something a bit more nebulous or a bit less formalized or calcified in the path that you have to take, I might tell them, you could go to university and get a degree that can help you signal the right things on the job market, but you could attain the same results doing something else and building a portfolio of, if you're reading and writing and researching and you're writing about the things that and publishing the things that you're learning, you can build up an equally solid foundation of credibility for yourself. And I'm curious how you think about that when you talk about the importance of the credentialing. Are you thinking about it more on an individual level or more on a societal level, as like there's, for like the whole societal system to function, we need this something to fill this need?
Yeah, so I think, I totally agree with what you're saying. Things got so bad at ASU in the last couple of years that I would interrogate some of my freshman students, like, why are you here exactly? Why? I mean, not in a mean kind of way, but I mean in a way like,
Yeah.
are you here because you want to be a nurse? And in order to be a nurse, you have to have a college degree. There is no path to being a nurse other than through the college route. Or are you just, what we used to call back in the good old days, an undecided student? If you're an undecided student, do not come to university. First of all, you're not allowed to be an undecided student anymore. It used to be when I was an undergraduate, it was very common for students to spend their first year or their second, even into their second year as exploratory students, right? They would take this, they would take that, and then they would sort of discover what they were interested in. They would discover what they were good at. And they might even change a couple of times. God forbid you change your major these days, right? You are expected to come into a university knowing what you want to do 5 years down the road. You are expected to come into a university knowing what you want to major in, and you are disincentivized from switching your majors. So you end up with a situation where you have students that are stuck in majors that they hate, they have no interest in, that sure as heck don't want to work in that field when they leave, but because it would cost them this or that to switch majors, they stay in these majors. So that's the first thing. If you're the sort of person who, at 17, 18 years old, you don't know exactly what you want, and or you know what you want and it's not one of these things that requires a college degree, I would strongly encourage you to, go to a community college, or maybe even better, just be an autodidact, right? Just teach yourself the stuff that you're interested in. Take advantage of the internet, take advantage of all of the amazing resources we have available in today's day and age to educate yourself. If you're not concerned with the certification, with the credential, then don't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the credential. You can get a quality education on your own prerogative, on your own initiative, right? You can do it yourself. So that's what I say to young people who are not particularly passionate about anything that requires a college degree. Do it on your own. Do it on your own. And maybe you'll find that you are passionate about something that does require a college degree, and then you might go off to college and pursue a degree. But don't go to a university. I mean, this is true especially of universities, less so of community colleges. But don't go to a university and expect to be able to sow your oats and explore different things and take advantage of your freshman and sophomore years to figure out what you want to study in your junior and senior years. You're just not allowed to do that anymore. So I am very sympathetic with the notion that if you don't need a college degree, or if you're not just, I mean, one of the things that's so great about our students at the University of Austin is that they definitely do not have this problem of not being interested in things. If anything, they have too many passions. They're interested in too many things, and they need to kind of rein it in, right, and sort of figure out what it is they want to study. If you're that kind of person that is just interested in education for its own sake, just interested in learning for its own sake, then you can still pursue, a liberal arts degree at a university or a liberal arts college, and you can get a lot out of it. So that's what I would say. If you're the sort of student who just wants to learn for its own sake, universities can be great. If you're the sort of student that knows what they want to do and that requires a college degree, by all means pursue that. But if you're just the kind of student that doesn't know at 17 or 18, or even, if you're coming out of the military at 24, 25, and you don't know what it is that you want to do exactly, don't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to figure it out at a university. Try to figure it out on your own and then take the university route if it appears that there's going to be value in that for you. But yeah, so I'm a big believer in autodidacticism, like just teaching yourself the stuff that you're interested in. And I'll say honestly, from my perspective, I was not a good student. I was certainly not a good student in up until college. It was only when I reached college and found something that I was really interested in, and something that I was passionate about, that I became a good student. Um, the rest of my time, I was teaching myself things. I learned far more as an elementary school student and through my high school years by reading things that I was interested in that I didn't have an opportunity to study. They weren't teaching. I've always been interested in politics, right? Well, they weren't teaching political philosophy or political theory or anything like that in elementary school or high school. So if I wanted to study, political philosophy, I had to do it on my own, and I did. And so, if you're that kind of a person, um, teach yourself, man. I really think it is the best way to go if you don't need that credential for anything.
I want to talk about the free speech issue on college campuses because it feels like your experience going down the tenure track is in some ways very related to this, even if it is less obvious on the surface. It sounds like, based on the way you told the story, they didn't directly tell you, we don't like your area of research, therefore we're not going to offer you tenure, and
Yeah,
also
no,
we're not going to
gonna
offer
tell
you
you
a
that.
job.
Yeah, they're not going to tell you that because I think that exposes them to legal liability because they're not supposed to make those evaluations. So,
Right.
yeah,
But there's no other obvious, if there is no other obvious explanation, then it appears that you were subjected to this sort of bias around what is and isn't kosher to talk about on college campuses, which there's also far more. It feels like there's sort of layers to this, where there's this on the surface, very obvious, very explicit war against free speech, where there are things that you cannot say and you will be canceled and you will lose your job if you say them. But then there are under layers of more subtle things that it's not polite to research, or things that you're not supposed to be asking about. And if you start going down those rabbit holes, you also will be basically removed from your access to university resources to pursue these things. And a lot of it isn't explicit. A lot of it's not explicitly stated, and yet it's clearly happening. But it flies directly in the face of what universities are proclaiming themselves to be,
right.
which is places to push the bounds of knowledge and explore the frontiers of what we know and look at things from new angles and say things that you maybe aren't supposed to say for the sake of arguing them. And, University of Austin is intended to be the direct opposite of that. It's designed to be a place where freedom of speech, above all else, is the value, is the mission. And I'm curious, I would imagine that was a very large part of the draw for you.
Yeah.
For University of Austin, it wasn't just, the lack of bureaucracy and the ability to start fresh. It was the freedom to go and study things that are not polite to do elsewhere or not in vogue elsewhere. But it's also a place where the whole goal is to create a culture where free speech is not just allowed, but it is actively encouraged.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what the experience has been like, both your perspective on what is happening, not just at ASU, but in the, conventional university system at large around free speech and against free speech, but also what the experience has been like inside of University of Austin in this first year of having students on campus.
Yeah, no, I think that so I might separate sort of the academic freedom questions, the question concerning your ostensible freedom to research whatever topics you want to research, which is supposed to be granted to all of us as professors, and the kind of the various ways in which that actually is not true, in which, like in my case, you are not granted tenure, or you're uh, even worse, invited to leave or whatever it might be for reasons that have to do with your research choices. So, like you said, like they didn't tell me that I didn't get tenure because I'm a Hayek scholar. I had to kind of infer that on my own. But that's also one way in which they can use the kind of bureaucratic structure of large universities as an excuse to not have to say those things explicitly, right? So um, if I were to inquire with them why I was not granted tenure, I'm quite sure they would give me some excuse that has really nothing to do with that has something to do with where, I didn't play the game well enough, or I didn't perform all of my service responsibility, whatever it might be. They would give me some um, BS excuse, basically. So there's that. But then there's the real freedom of speech issues surrounding things like, well, from students' perspectives, whether they can say, advocate for Israel or advocate for whatever sort of disfavor, advocate for, against DEI, or advocate against, trans issues or things like that. I mean, they're supposed to have freedom of speech. They're supposed to have the freedom to advocate for whatever they want to advocate for. Um, so those are the kind of student issues. But then from a faculty perspective, as you referenced, there are the concerns where, if you say something in a faculty meeting, or if you say something on social media, you're going to get canceled. You're going to get piled on by either other people in your department, other people in your university, or just other people in society writ large are going to attack you on social media, and there will be consequences for that. Um, so, I think that one thing that is important to keep in mind is, and this relates to the Claudine Gay issue and the freedom of speech stuff, is, you know, you don't necessarily have you don't have the same freedoms within a university that you have outside a university, right? So you can go stand on the street corner and yell whatever crazy stuff that you want to yell. You can yell awful things against Jews. Whatever you want, you can do it. That's what our constitutionally secured right to freedom of speech allows. In a university, though, there can be, and I think there should be, restrictions about protecting other students' rights. So this was part of the concern with the Harvard and Columbia issues that we were dealing with last year. Was, did those pro-Palestinian protesters have a right to say the things they wanted to say the horrible anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist things that they wanted to say? Do they have a right to say those things? Well, yes, on the corner of the university. Outside the university, they have a right to say those things. Within the university, no. They cannot threaten their fellow Jewish students. They cannot say things that are sound quasi-genocidal about various peoples. They cannot say those things within a university context, because that constitutes a threat to other students. So it is important, I think, to make that distinction between the sort of complete freedom of speech that we have just in general, and the more restricted speech that we have within certain institutional contexts. What is so problematic about what's been going on in today's universities is that um, the restrictions seem to only go in one direction, right? So um, you could not at Harvard or Columbia express skepticism about, say, transgenderism or about the Palestinian movement without being criticized and called onto the carpet for exactly the kind of threatening behavior that they were allowing the other side to get away with, right? So I think that's been the major problem with the like the Claudine Gay incident, was that she was allowing the Palestinians to say all of these horrible, hateful, threatening things against Jewish students, threatening the ability of Jewish students to matriculate at the university, um, while at the same time not allowing, you know, people on the other side to say critical things about certain races, about certain gender identifications, right? So it was really this two-tiered or double-faced kind of application of those restrictions, which I do think every university needs to have in place. So, the University of Austin is not immune from those kinds of concerns, in that the sort of things that the students are allowed to say when they're standing outside the Scarborough building where the university is located, they're allowed to say things outside that building. They're allowed to yell whatever epithets they want because that speech is constitutionally protected. They can say certain things there that they cannot say on the third floor of the Scarborough building, right? Because inside the institution, it constitutes a threat, or it can potentially constitute a threat to other students. So we are, I think, trying to maintain. Um, we're trying to maintain our standards whereby we expect students to be respectful of each other and not say threatening things to each other, while also emphasizing that they do have their free speech rights. They can speak outside of the university context on whatever topics they want to discuss. And also, I think we're emphasizing that within the classroom, um, few topics are outside the bounds of discussion or outside the bounds of debate, provided they don't cross into that territory of being potentially threatening or potentially, um, you know, uh, um, we want our students to feel protected. So, we will put some constraints on anything that might sound threatening to other students. But, if you want to have a discussion about um, critical race theory, if you want to have a discussion about gender ideology, if you want to have a discussion about the Israel-Palestine conflict, those topics are all open for debate at the University of Austin, provided you don't threaten anyone. But the difference is that I don't think you could have those discussions in classrooms at, well, certainly not Harvard, Columbia, MIT, USC, UCLA. You would be stamped down, I think, if you express certain views in the classrooms at those institutions. Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit on the difference between, in your mind, between the space on the corner outside of the campus where you can say anything you want, including something threatening, because that's a constitutional right, versus inside the campus where you can say most of what you want, but you can't say something that's threatening to someone else on campus, whether that's a student or a faculty member? What is the difference between the free speech that is protected outside the university and the free speech that's protected within, that makes that caveat both justifiable but also necessary? Because you're giving something up in a sense by saying free speech, but
Yeah.
and yet there's a reason why that's important. Can you expand on that?
Well, I think it's a number of things. So first of all, there are legal obligations that institutions like University of Austin and ASU and every university have to protect all the students, right? So to some extent, this is just a legal requirement that we enforce certain restrictions on anything that might appear threatening within the confines of the institution. But then what you're really asking is, what is the logic behind having those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of that potential legal liability? And you know, I'm not a constitutional scholar, nor am I a I have no legal background whatsoever, so I don't want to speculate too much on that or where that comes from. But my assumption is that it has a lot to do with the civil rights movement over the course of the 20th century, particularly the last half of the 20th century. How do you for example, in a university, a state university in, say, Mississippi or Alabama in 1965, how do you open your doors to Black students in such a way that they're not threatened within the institution, right? So you do need to have some, I think, restrictions like that that just protect everybody, protect their ability to get an education, right?
Well,
So
I'm asking less about the why behind the legality of it, and maybe that is the extent of the answer. It's legally required, therefore we have to do this. I was asking more from like a institutional culture standpoint. Is there from a if legalities aside if that didn't exist, is there still a benefit in your mind to having restrictions on the types of things that people can say on campus from, you know, a quality of culture and like the cultivation of the kind of environment that is important for learning? Is there an argument on that side separate from the legalities, or is it more a, these are the requirements of being an institution sort of issue?
I would think, I mean, I I think the best answer I could give would be the institutional culture aspect would be um, the virtue of having those kinds of limited restrictions on threatening speech is, one would hope, a improvement in the sort of respect with which people treat each other, right?
Hmm.
The sort of, um, I mean, I'm trying to think of of an example, right? You might have an example where um, a student says something that might be construed, whether it's intended or not, that might be construed as threatening or demeaning of another student. And if you have demeaning is, let's set demeaning aside, threatening to another student. And I think one of the reasons to have those kinds of restrictions is just to ensure, to enforce a kind of mutual respect among your students and your faculty and your administration, right? You knowing that if someone um, says to me, if I give them, knowing that if a student says to me, if you give me a C, I'm going to shoot you, knowing that there will be repercussions if they say something like that, um, is a little bit, it's, I'm happy. I mean, that's good. That's good to know. But
Well,
it also,
it
it
is
also,
just good culturally.
right. It constitutes a form of presumed respect that we all have for each other, that we're not going to say certain things to each other, and if we do, there will be consequences. So yeah, I think there's some reason to maintain minimal standards of restriction of certain kinds of threatening speech, just as as a means of ensuring that we all treat each other decently and as human beings, right?
Which is, intuitively logical as well. It makes sense. It's just good from a cultural standpoint. You want to create an environment where people are arguing with each other in good faith, which means intimidating each other is not, it isn't serving the goal, which is freedom of debate, discussion, pursuit of truth, argument about what that means. You can't bully someone into taking your side.
Right. No, that's exactly right.
For it's at odds with the goal.
Yeah.
So from that standpoint, it makes sense. But in every other sense beyond speech that is harming another, which is like really a very libertarian sort of take on this, with the exception of anything that harms another's property you have the freedom to do whatever you want. With the exception of speech that infringes on another, you have the right to say whatever you want. In my mind is sort of, there's this illusion that that is the stated goal of many universities, or the sort of implied goal, but is not really being enforced. And yet University of Austin, like, that is the entire goal.
Yeah, I think what you've had happen in the last decade or so is an expansion of the traditional concept of what constitutes threatening speech, right? So, um, the example I gave, a student says he's gonna shoot me if I don't give him a certain grade. That's, I think, pretty clearly threatening. But merely saying something like, "Yeah, I'm not sure if women can become men." That's come to be interpreted as a threat. Now, to me, that does not sound threatening at all. I mean, there's no implication that merely by disagreeing with the notion or being skeptical about the notion that people can change their sex, that there's any threat there to harm people who might attempt to change their sex. But the way that those kinds of arguments or claims have come to be interpreted in the modern university is as a threat, or as at least an implied threat. So that's the mechanism by which a lot of these universities are allowed to shut down that kind of speech, is by taking what no one 20 years ago would have considered to be threatening and redefining it as threatening. So I think that's a lot of what you see going on in terms of speech restrictions in universities these days, is reinterpreting disagreements, reinterpreting debate as harmful, threatening kind of behavior. And of course, once you start going down that road, then speech really does become frozen, right? Because then you start thinking. And this is another thing that I wanted to that I wanted to mention in response to your last question, is the sort of self-censoring that goes on at universities. When you don't know where the lines are, when you don't know how exactly something you might say is likely to be interpreted and what the consequences might be, you just don't speak. I mean, I know that in my situation at ASU in the last 5 years or so, I've shut up about a lot of things. I mean, I was never really the sort of person who would express my political beliefs in a faculty meeting, but I remember having a debate with some, or not even a debate, but just a conversation with some people in a faculty meeting in 2016. It was actually the day after Donald Trump was elected. And I should stipulate by saying I'm no fan of Donald Trump. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. Blah 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 blah. Okay, so let me get that all out in front. But I'm certainly not. I don't suffer from Trump derangement syndrome at all, and I've never really understood what the big deal is about with these people that despise Trump so much. So I remember the day after Trump was elected, we had a faculty meeting, and all of my colleagues were just up in arms, and it was all racism. America is racist. America is just a bunch of racists, just a bunch of racists who voted for Donald Trump. And I just said, a lot of those racists voted for Barack Obama in 2012, right? Like, I mean, I don't think I would have said that. I don't think I would have said that in 2020. I don't think I would have even ventured that kind of a reasonably harmless and pretty obvious and true comment. I felt comfortable saying that in 2016. I would not have felt comfortable saying that by the time 2020 rolled around. So that kind of thing. Now, that's not to say that I would have necessarily gotten in trouble in 2020 for saying something like that. It was just that I didn't know where the lines were at that point, right? So when everything becomes threatening, everything becomes harmful, or at least potentially so, then you 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 censor yourself. You pause before you say things that you might have said in another kind of environment where the lines were much clearer, right? Like, I know if I threaten someone with a gun, That's gonna there are gonna be consequences for that if I do it at work, right? There are gonna be consequences for that. But I don't know if I say something like, well, a lot of those supposed racists voted for Barack Obama in 2012. If I don't know whether that's something that's going to be censored or that's something that's going to subject me to potential cancellation or worse, then I just won't say it. And if you're not prepared to say things like that, then what happens in that kind of context? Well, those people who just are convinced that it's racism keep talking and keep convincing each other about it, about how it's all racism, right? So, um, and you don't end up having the kind of debates, the kind of discussions that you would otherwise have if the lines were much clearer, and if, in particular, those lines were restricted to things that were obviously threatening.
Which I think is a good way of framing this, because I think it's something that for a lot of people, it's not, well, I mean, by definition, it's not intuitive. What you just described is not intuitive. Lines aren't clear. They're not clearly stated, but you also can't really intuit them clearly. And so it's hard to define what should and shouldn't be okay to say, because there are some things that obviously are hurtful and, not in good faith to be saying to another person.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of things that are a gray area and there's a reason why this becomes sticky inside of organizations, even though it shouldn't be. And I think the way you defined it is really clear.
It's never going to be perfectly black and white, right? There will always be a gray area, but the more expansive you make the concept of harm, or you make the concept of threat, the bigger the gray area becomes, I think. And so I think you need to have, as clearly as possible, you need to have restrictions that are clearly described. Like I said, you're not going to get away. There's always going to be a gray area. So there will always be edge cases where you're not sure whether this falls into the category or not. But, and that's why you have things like, grievance committees and things like that. Their responsibility is to determine whether some sort of behavior falls within the category of harmful and threatening or not. But you do need to have as clearly delineated lines as possible. And that will, I think, open up the speech environment as much as possible. And I also think, this is probably not a very popular thing to say. I think you need to have structures in place whereby the institution can say to someone who is complaining of a potential threat, get over yourself. I mean, it's like that's not really threatening. Like what someone may have said in criticizing gender ideology is not the same thing as threatening you with a gun. So let's not pretend like it is, right? I think you need to have some adults in the room who just say to the children, "No, get over yourselves. That's not a threat. Like, just let's move on." And find a modus vivendi, find a way to agree to disagree with your colleagues, and let's just try to work as kindly and respectfully towards each other as we possibly can.
We didn't even have a chance in this conversation to dig into the work that you do, which would be of interest to a lot of people listening to this. There are many Austrian economics, many people listening to this with a very soft spot for Austrian econ. We may have to talk about that at a future point in time.
That'd be great.
But if people have listened to this conversation and have enjoyed it and want to learn more about you or read more of your work, or are interested in going down the Hayek rabbit hole with you, where would you send them next?
Well, so I run a Substack page, which is Policymaker Ignorance, all one word, the word policymaker and ignorance all combined together, .substack.com. And you can find out a lot about my research there. My current research project, as that name suggests, all considers the consequence. What happens when policymakers don't know what they're doing? What do policymakers do when they don't know what they're doing? That's a simple way of
bad things.
Well, that's the answer that I tend to give. So if you were to go to my Policymaker Ignorance Substack page, pinned to the top of the page is a kind of brief description of my research project and what I take to be important about it. So that's what I would suggest. I'm also on Twitter at PM, as in policymaker, PM Ignorance One. You can find me there, and I'm not very active on Twitter. I really just post pretty much anything you find on my Substack page, you can find on my Twitter page, and vice versa. I will say that my Substack page is on a little bit of a hiatus right now. I primarily use my Substack page to post my podcast. I do a podcast called "The Week in Policymaker Ignorance," and I aspire. I originally planned it to be a weekly podcast. My dog is saying hello here to the audience. I originally planned it to be a weekly podcast, but it proved to be way too much work to try to do it on a weekly basis. I think I didn't quite understand all the work that was going to go into trying to produce these weekly episodes. So I kind of scaled it back a little bit, and I really only post when I have interesting topics to discuss. And I'm on a hiatus right now because I'm developing a series of podcasts. It'll be probably 4 or 5 episodes on policymaker ignorance and the history of the Vietnam War. So that's requiring quite a lot of, and as you probably can imagine, and surely already know, there was a lot of ignorance involved in how we ran the Vietnam War. So I hope to be back with new episodes in the new year. I'm working on the series right now. So yeah, that's where people can go to find out a little bit about me and my research. There's also some work there on some of my my work on Hayek, and to tease your Austrian fans. All of this work on policymaker ignorance is a development of my work on Hayek. So you can take a look at my Substack page. You can also go out and spend $100 some odd on my 2020 book, which was called F.A. Hayek in the Epistemology of Politics. That book that I referenced earlier that is available for free on the internet, it's called, what is it called? Dialogues Concerning Natural Politics, and it's available for free on my Substack page. And you can find out how I use the administration of Arizona State University as a paradigm of ignorant policymakers. Yeah.
I can't wait for the Substack series or podcast series rather, on the Vietnam War. This is going to be fascinating.
I've done a couple of these sort of longer series. I did one on the beginning of World War I and policymaker ignorance. So all of the ridiculous events that led to the beginning of World War I. And then I did another series on the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles and all that, which of course led us to World War II. So there are a couple of longer series like that I've done on the show, which everybody can find. So, and the podcast is also available on Apple and all the standard podcast apps.
Amazing. This is a lot of great places for people to dig in. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been really fun.
Thanks for having me, Hannah. I look forward to seeing you when I get back to Austin. Have a great holiday season, okay?
The feeling is very mutual. Have a great holiday. Also, good luck going to the Department of Student Services or whatever it's called and arguing about this check. I wish you the very best.
Yeah, if my head doesn't explode at some point this afternoon, it'll be a good day. So
I hope it does not. Have a great holiday season.
You too. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Scott. All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.